Thanks, everyone. Did anyone indulge in the chocolate cake? Yep. Does anyone actually cook? Have baked a cake? Baked a chocolate cake? Yep. I'm just using this analogy as a point to make, whether it be chocolate cake or not, but we all might have some sort of favourite in our lives. But the interesting thing about chocolate cake that occurred to me at the break, because I couldn't decide between that or the carrot cake, so I had to have both, but we all can come to a similar conclusion or outcome using completely different recipes. So with that in mind, we've got this presentation today, and I'm very fortunate to be going first, but we have three presenters who've all come to the point of helping to kick off a citizen advocacy program using three different methods or approaches. When I first started off in human services, I found this quote, and it's been on every wall of every office that I've ever had, and it's even on my home office. I work from home now. It's really a great motivator, but I think it really captures the essence of what human beings are to each other. Now, when it comes to Capricorn Citizen Advocacy, and we're based in Rockhampton, central Queensland, not quite on the coast, but we are on the Tropic of Capricorn. Back in 1993, and they seem like very heady days when we compare them to nowadays, this is pretty much what happened in our neck of the woods. Margaret Mead summed it up. There was a small group of us, human services were starting to develop, but we found each other and we began talking, and it became abundantly clear, or clearer, that advocacy was needed in our community. We felt that there was a need to protect the more marginalised members of our community. There was none of what we know in this generation back then as that famous four-letter word that we now have a love-hate relationship with, the NDIS. And before you go any further, I know it's not a word, it's an acronym, but bear with me. There were services, many of which were provided by government, but they were very few and far between, and, we won't even go down the quality pathway. Churches were growing their social justice arms. Even some small non-profits were starting to kick off. And indeed, some for-profit organisations were starting to enter into the delivery of services that were supposed to be helping people with disabilities. There were still many people with disabilities who were becoming potentially more marginalised and were falling through surprisingly bigger cracks despite all of these new things popping up. And many basic needs were remaining unmet. So it's hard to think that this was almost 30 years ago, but we were most fortunate to have struck a place in time where all the planets seem to have aligned. No doubt you've heard that before. I hope to goodness you too have felt the joy of that happening in your life over something. Those of us who were having those early conversations all seem to be on what we call the same page. It may have been something to do with us all of us starting our social role valorisation journey. We all had a very well-oiled social justice bent, or it might have been something to do with our national consciousness around the notion of human rights starting to get some serious traction. The other thing to consider, and Heather mentioned this earlier in her presentation, just about everything in life you'll find that context really does matter. So at this time, there were many things happening in the mid to late 80s and up to the late 90s, even early 2000s, such as new legislation, lots of SRV training. The notion of community development was really taking off. And of course, some of you were actually at this event, the Social Advocacies event in Brisbane in 1997. I remember it very well. One of those big milestones that you never quite have leave your memory. Prior to that, in Queensland, and this is where I'm going to talk a little bit Queensland, but it's the context that I think has really, nurtured the development of our organisation. Joint funding was received to support an advocacy development project, and that was supposed to investigate and discern the need for advocacy in all of its forms throughout the state of Queensland. A small steering group was set up to direct the project, and that was convened by some familiar names coming up here: Anne Cross from Community Resource Unit, Jeremy Ward from Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion, which at the time was Queensland Advocacy Incorporated, Jan Dyke from Queensland Parents for People with Disabilities, Jude Hose, a very dear friend of mine from the Capricorn Community Development Association, Julie Ford from Independent Advocacy in the Tropics, Eric Jones, who we heard about earlier, from the Sunshine Coast, and then there was Penny Watson and Judy Pagan representing the Commonwealth and the state respectively. These were really heady days. Mary Kenny was hired as the project worker for that project. The project went for nearly 18 months and provided enormous support to our wee tiny organisation in Rocky. They also produced some excellent resources. So moving from thoughts to action was a folder, the one on the left, which comprised information sheets and a study guide. And the one on the right, the Framework for Advocacy Development in Queensland, was a really important document as well. It was so useful for any advocacy organisation that was starting to get really serious about becoming a fair dinkum organisation that was out there doing advocacy. The next phase in the development of disability advocacy in Queensland was the formation of Action for Advocacy Development, very soon followed by the Advocacy Development Network. And I became a part of that specifically for the opportunity to learn from other people who were in that network and, dare I say, even back then, to try and help them understand more about citizen advocacy, because by that time we were fairly well hooked on the idea that in our community we were going to do citizen advocacy. So there were organisations involved in those two groups from, again, QAI. Someone mentioned SUFI or Speaking Up For You before. At that time, SUFI was a self-advocacy organisation. Now it's an individual advocacy organisation. And that's probably not a bad thing. All organisations evolve and change over time. That's quite a big change, but it's important to note. And of course, Queensland Parents for People with Disability were continued to be involved. So, back to us, CCA for short. In 1995, a group of citizens around Rocky and the Capricorn Coast formed what we called the Rockhampton Advocacy Development Focus Group. The group's charter was to develop a clearer understanding of advocacy and to develop a submission to seek recurrent funding to provide advocacy support in and around the Rockhampton district. We had lots of fun, did lots of learning, and with the help of many others involved in citizen advocacy, other allies in advocacy, and to this day, very valued friends. The RADFG was successful in obtaining a very small grant at this time. This is before we got recurrent funding. And the purpose of that grant was to deepen our understanding and the community's understanding of and commitment to strong values-based advocacy for people with disability. That was a little bit over $11,000, which back then we thought we'd won lotto. Now it'll barely touch the sides. However, it enabled us to engage two people from within our group, Jude Hose and Carolyn Friend, another familiar name for many, who conducted numerous interviews, helped our group to learn lots more about the various forms of advocacy, and they went on many visits to other advocacy agencies, including citizen advocacy programs, but even overseas. People use their overseas trips to just drop in. What do you guys do? we were just like a big sponge, soaking it all up. One of the other important things that we did was to conduct a community-based survey. I can't remember how big it was, but back then it was considered to be quite a substantial, weighty survey. And the purpose of that survey was to try and make that decision. What sort of advocacy does our community really want? We as a group knew what we wanted to do. Surprisingly, that was citizen advocacy. But very, very hearteningly, the survey came back and gave us a very clear message that they too saw that citizen advocacy was what our community wanted. So that really answered that question. If some of what you're seeing on the board there, you know, the words consultation and visits and workshops and dialogue, if that seems familiar, it's probably because it should be. It's really all about community development. And we got probably our biggest support from Capricorn Community Development Association. And thankfully, that group is still in existence today. So I thought it might be useful, at least it was for me when I was preparing this, to look at a bit of a timeline. And so we look back at 1993, those early conversations. We had lots of informal meetings, and we too met on people's verandas, in their kitchens, in their lounges. And fortunately, we had lots of very clever, informed people come to visit with us and even conduct some of those workshops. So there was just lots and lots of conversation. So you'll see 95, our Advocacy Development Focus Group formed. We had the research. Then, of course, the Social Advocacies event was, it was just a really key event for us. Once we got the final results from our survey, we knew we had to get into strategic planning mode. We couldn't just keep, you know, treading water. We had to be doing something really practical and substantial to get underway. At that time, we thought it'd be really clever and consolidate this group and choose a new name. We're no longer a focus group. We knew what we were focused on. So we chose the new name of Advocacy Works. And, you know, what fads are like, we thought were pretty darn clever because that fitted a lot of other commercial names that were popping up. But we didn't last with that name too long. We had our first public meeting because we needed to do that to become incorporated. And at that public meeting, it was almost hijacked by a number of people who had heard about it but hadn't been specifically invited because they wanted us to advocate for everybody, as you do. And, you know, their argument really was that to do otherwise would be enormously discriminatory. And people were just learning about this whole notion of anti-discrimination at that time, so they felt they had a very strong argument. Luckily, the person that we had asked to chair that meeting was a local friend who was a solicitor, and he was able to quickly put that notion to bed. The power of having good allies. I like a good cartoon. I think that says everything. But one of the things I found when I was trying to come up with some analogies here is this quote from Mr. George Foreman, of all people. I don't even know him as a boxer and a guy selling grills. But I think this is a piece of wisdom that we should all take on board for anything new that we're going to contemplate. But of course, we're talking today about anybody contemplating a new citizen advocacy program in their organisation. Basically, it's the same thing. Don't reinvent the wheel. Talk to people who are already doing good citizen advocacy and who've got the rungs on the board, who seem to know what they're doing and, more importantly, have the energy and drive to help you start things up. So don't waste time coming up with a new better version of citizen advocacy. There's no such thing as the perfect model, perfect recipe, but following the citizen advocacy model does make learning the ropes easier. If you're clever about it, you'll find that most of the ideas that you come up to finesse the model might not amount to much in the bigger scheme of things anyway. The citizen advocacy model as we know it is extraordinarily well thought through, and it's stood the test of time, as someone said earlier today, for more than 50 years. So, as you no doubt gathered, not only do I like a good quote, but I actually really enjoy talking in analogy. So I'm going to move into that mode now. Once you've opted to establish a citizen advocacy program, not only should you learn from others, but you need to nourish the program intensively at first, like anything new. And I use the analogy of just like a highly prized orchid. You should be clear about the outcomes that you're expecting from doing good citizen advocacy and use those tools created to measure success. Again, others doing citizen advocacy can help you with this. We've already talked about CAPE. One thing that we haven't said so far, though, is that it is the only universally recognised evaluation tool for any form of disability advocacy. And we already know it's a great learning tool as well. I'd suggest forging trusting collegial relationships with others who are committed to doing good CA and trying to learn from them so you too can keep your program bearing sweet fruit. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but do be prepared to learn from them. It really is the only way to make you strong. It's never easy to hear that you've taken a misstep, but just remember, it's probably even more difficult for the person to break that news to you. We in Citizen Advocacy are a pretty strong, committed, yet sensitive bunch of people. And sometimes we don't like to hear that our practices might not quite fit the model. And unfortunately, and this is the danger of creating something that's a little bit finessed, is it can actually end up causing harm, either to a protege, a citizen advocate, to the board, to the program. And in turn, that does the community no favours at all. So look after the program as closely and attentively so you can ensure that the citizen advocacy program aligns with the principles. One of the things that I think is really important about starting up a new program is understanding what's different about it. What makes citizen advocacy stand out from individual advocacy, family advocacy, systems advocacy, etc. That sort of clarity is really important, not just to keep yourself on track, but when you're engaging with other people, you feel more comfortable in describing what it is that you do. Be vigilant about internal and external threats. Just as I said earlier, accept that you will make mistakes, but be prepared to move on. It is a tough journey. Be kind to yourself and all those other people in the room. Don't be tempted to enter into an argument. Try to see the other person's point of view. You could lose a really important ally by going down that path. Very important to remember your origins and what actually got you set on this pathway in the first place. This is one of the reasons why most of us come on this pathway. We know we can't save the world, but we can make a big difference in the life of one, even dozens of people, by using the citizen advocacy model. Heather Buck, unfortunately, isn't in this room, but I'm using one of her quotes. I think it'll resonate with you. It's really important to understand that citizen advocacy is about finding those people that other advocacy forms don't seek out or have come to them. I think that's extra important. We've already talked about the importance of stories as well, and I'm not going to read these out, but rather leave them up there very briefly for the speed readers amongst you to get through. I would strongly suggest that you start to accumulate stories, even in your infancy as a new program, because that can really resonate with other people who are struggling to understand what it is that you're describing to them. A couple of final pieces of advice. Be aware of complacency. And again, I think it might have been Zaina who mentioned that earlier. You can fall into the trap of thinking, oh, right, we're in the groove now, we know what we're doing. And all of a sudden, whammo. there will be something that comes along to divert your attention from doing that good citizen advocacy practice, and you'll need to just reset yourself. This too has already been mentioned, but for me, and you'll know why I'm emphasising this if you happen to come to one of our other presentations later, there's probably nothing more important in citizen advocacy than really understanding the depth of meaning behind this saying. He who pays the piper really does call the tune. There are implications in accepting funding which superficially all of us will get, but it's just as easy for that funding to dry up, and it's not so much, or not altogether, the loss of funding, but the implications otherwise can be just as troubling. We had a little history book done up recently, and there were some recollections that I'm just reproducing here, and I'm reproducing them from the point of view that if you're going to start something new, whether it be a citizen advocacy program or something else, try not to wait for 5 or 10 or 15 years before you think, oh, we really should have jotted down this bit of history. Write it down as you're going. Not only will you be happy that you did because you don't have such a big job at some other point in time, but it'll be a hell of a lot more accurate. I'd like to finish with another quote, this time from an Aussie who we probably all should be aware of. His name is John Eccles, and he was an Australian neurophysiologist. He won the Nobel Prize in 1963 for physiology or medicine for his work on the synapse, and how apt is that for us in this room? So I won't read out his quote, but he's essentially saying we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our predecessors. So do remember the work of those who've gone before you, because from that you can learn. And if you're anything like me, you'll learn what mistakes not to make yourself. Thanks very much.